This Notebook LM video explores how a faith born in suffering and martyrdom transformed into an institution that wielded power to persecute dissent. Within a generation, Christianity became the empire's official religion, redefining heresy as treason and turning its authority against pagans, Jews, and even fellow believers.
You know, what happens when the victims become the villains? It sounds like something out of a movie, but it's exactly the story we're diving into today. We're going to trace one of the most unbelievable flip-flops in all of history, how a faith that was built on the suffering of martyrs completely transformed into a global power that persecuted its own. So let's get right to the heart of it. The central paradox, the big question, is this. How did the cross, literally a symbol of a state-sponsored execution, become an emblem of state-enforced power? I mean, that's a wild transformation, and we're going to unpack the exact moments that made it all happen.
Okay, so our story has to start with the early Christians. For almost 300 years, this movement was viewed with suspicion. They faced brutal persecution. We've all heard the stories of believers being thrown to the lions in the Colosseum. And why? Well, their refusal to worship the Roman emperor was seen as straight-up treason, which made them outcasts and, well, targets.
Now, this history of suffering, it isn't just some historical footnote. It's really woven into the very DNA of the Christian identity. The New Testament itself kind of frames persecution as an expected, almost necessary part of being a believer. This whole us-against-the-world mentality, it would shape the Christian worldview for centuries to come.
So what was the game changer? What flipped the script? It wasn't some new theological breakthrough or a lost scripture being discovered. Nope. It was the fusion of the church with the one thing that changes absolutely everything, the raw, absolute power of the Roman state.
And this slide right here reveals a massive turning point, the weaponization of a single word, heresy. It went from being a theological disagreement, a wrong opinion, to a full-blown political crime. See, for an empire that was desperate for social unity, religious uniformity was political stability. And this redefinition, well, it basically became a license to kill for the next 1,000 years.
And just look at the speed of this transformation. It's staggering. In 303, Christians are literally being hunted down. By 380, less than a single lifetime later, their faith is the Roman Empire. And then just 5 years after that, the state is used by Christians to kill another Christian over a doctrinal disagreement. A line had been crossed, big time.
So the real takeaway here is that once the external threat, Roman paganism, was gone, the newly empowered church turned its focus inward. The enemy was no longer the pagan at the city gates. The enemy was now the fellow Christian who dared to disagree. Dissent had officially become treason.
And this new power, it didn't stay a one-off thing. Oh no, it evolved. It grew into this organized, systematic machine of suppression.
By the time we get to the High Middle Ages, this machine had a very clear target, groups like the Cathars. Now, in the eyes of the Pope, their beliefs weren't just a difference of opinion. He saw them as a spiritual cancer, a sickness that had to be brutally, surgically removed from the body of Christendom.
This one quote, whether it was literally said or not, it's just chilling, because it reveals everything about the fanatical violence that was unleashed. When the Pope offered up the lands of southern lords to northern nobles who would fight for the cause, well, faith got all mixed up with greed, and suddenly heresy became a fantastic excuse for total war.
Right, so the crusade was kind of a blunt instrument. To really finish the job, the church created the Inquisition. This wasn't mob violence anymore. This was organized, bureaucratic terror. And here's the insidious little legal trick they used. The church could claim it never killed anyone. It just, found them guilty and then handed them over to the state for the secular act of burning. Clean hands, right?
And that brings us to what is maybe the greatest irony in this entire story. A movement, the Reformation, that began as a protest against the abuses of the Catholic Church. A movement built on the noble idea of freedom of conscience ended up repeating the exact same patterns it was protesting against.
I mean, the hypocrisy is just staggering. On the one hand, the reformers are demanding freedom. On the other, they're subjecting Anabaptists, who were just Christians who believed in adult baptism, to this cruel parody of their own beliefs by drowning them. They cried, "Scripture alone," and then turned around and burned people alive for interpreting that same scripture differently. You just have to ask, how could this happen all over again?
And the most infamous example of this has to be Michael Servetus. This guy was literally running for his life from the Catholic Inquisition.
only to get caught and executed by the Protestant leader John Calvin in Geneva. This one brutal act showed that the impulse to kill heretics had completely crossed the Protestant-Catholic divide, and it was so shocking it actually sparked some of the first real arguments for religious toleration in Europe. To really get a sense of the horrifying scale of this violence, just look at this number, approximately 30,000. That's the estimated death toll from a single event, the St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre in 1572, where Catholic mobs went on a rampage, slaughtering French Protestants. For over a century, Europe was just engulfed in these religious wars, turning neighbor against neighbor.
So, after centuries of this bloodshed, what's the big takeaway? Well, out of complete and total exhaustion, a radical new idea began to emerge. It was born from the realization that trying to force belief wasn't just cruel, it was completely self-destructive.
And this was the radical solution that rose from the ashes, the separation of church and state. The rise of secular governments, founded on the principle of protecting individual rights, was a deliberate, conscious attempt to sever that toxic link between religious authority and state power. The idea was that disagreements over what you believe would no longer be settled by an executioner.
But, a history this long and this bloody, it leaves behind a deep psychological scar. And we have to be really careful to distinguish between genuine, ongoing persecution and what's known as a persecution complex. This is where a group's very real historical trauma can get kind of weaponized, framing any modern criticism or even just a loss of cultural influence as some existential threat, as if it's a repeat of the past.
Because here's the thing. That fundamental tension between belief and power, it hasn't just vanished. The human impulse to hold a conviction with absolute certainty and the temptation to use power to enforce it, that's a constant. It just speaks a different language now. So the real question for us is, where do we see this playing out today? In our political tribes, in our social movements, in our online communities, where are the new forms of heresy being punished? Not with fire and sword, but with social ostracism and the silencing of dissent.